show you how deeply reputable.
Hey guys, welcome to The Unfiltered, and we're going to be talking about the Idaho 4 case again today. I do want to talk about investigation in the early stages. I think when this whole investigation started to crack under public pressure, they definitely needed somebody who could make sense of what was going on. Somebody professional who could basically take a very messy and contradictory story and make it look clean and compelling and even believable. And that's where I think Howard Blum comes in. When you have somebody who is a journalist with a lot of experience and a lot of respect, who's calm and has a very good reputation, that's basically a magic formula, because it would make it look like law enforcement are dedicated truth seekers who are tackling this enormous case, and people won't question something like that. Now, I'm not going to accuse Howard of doing anything shady. I think he didn't even realize that he was being used as an asset. The point I'm making is that nobody would have had to tell him what to write. It would be very simple to give him access to information, maybe sprinkle in a bit of side tips or a quote from an anonymous source. Also add in how hard these detectives are working, and suddenly you have a narrative that feels very authentic. While the public thought they were reading this groundbreaking investigative book, I think what's actually being read was very carefully engineered. Something that was powered by Howard Blum's name and integrity. And that's how his credibility became a big influence into what people perceived happened in this entire case. To break this down, you have to go to that book even before the very first chapter, where he says something, and that is, people talk. And I find that statement very telling. So off he goes into a wintry Idaho to report on the unalivings of the 4 college students. According to him, his confidence wavered. This was when that judge issued a gag order that stopped anyone with first-hand knowledge speaking to the press. Of course, despite this whole court ruling, Blum says that people were willing to share whatever information they had for the right price. And he says that that didn't really sit well with him. According to him, he knocked on doors, took people out for lunches, coffees, that kind of thing. He also mentioned that he had built up friendships over the years with law enforcement, and he had to call in favors from them when necessary. All of this allowed him a behind-the-scenes look into what was happening. Just saying that people talk says a lot, because who are the people that were talking? This book doesn't really start in the way that you would expect. It doesn't open with what happened or even with Brian Koberger himself. It starts with this road trip where Brian Koberger's father went cross country to go and fetch him. And that feels very intentional, because he starts to describe how Michael Koberger flew all the way from Pennsylvania to Washington to go and meet Brian after he finished his first semester as a PhD student in Washington State. The way it's written, you can tell that Blum wants to send a message. First, he frames Michael as a very proud father, a maintenance man whose son somehow made it into this big, nationally recognized justice program. He even writes that Michael was already calling his son Dr. Brian Christopher Koberger. Brian's mom, Mary Ann, said that he was complicated. So there's a bit of a conflict there. Now, both parents worked at a school in Pennsylvania. His mother, Mary Ann, worked with special needs children, and Michael was a janitor. But straight after that, Blum says that Michael supposedly told relatives that raising Brian threw him for a bit of a loop. And he used to tell his daughter that there's no telling what Brian might do next. Now, how on earth would anybody know that kind of information? I mean, none of the Coburgers have ever spoken publicly about this case. So the question is, where is all of this information coming from? And you can see that he first sets the stage to say that he is a very good student, and straight away going into framing him as there's no telling what he's going to do next. So he claimed that Michael wanted to reconnect and make peace with Brian after years of tension. And also that he wanted to see which version of Brian would show up, because apparently Brian was a master of disguise. Or how would he know that Michael said something like that to whom? How does Blum know any of this? Then he talks about this detour route home. And apparently they argued because Brian's dad had mapped out the shortest route straight across the country. And according to him, when the time came to leave Pullman, Brian suddenly changed his mind and he wanted to go south through Colorado instead and pick up on I-70, which didn't make sense to his father. So he said that in order to keep the peace, he just told Brian, "You're the boss." And supposedly he told people that when Brian got into one of his know-it-all moods, the only way he could handle him was to back off. Now again, these are very private conversations or thoughts. I don't know that he could read his mind. Nothing has been confirmed. So where is all this information coming from? And mind you, this is only in chapter 1. So then he writes about Brent Kopacka, who was the Washington State University veteran, and he was taken down by an entire SWAT team not long after the unalivings. And he doesn't mention this casually. There's a few detailed pages. Now, apparently Michael heard about this on the radio on the drive back to Pennsylvania. It said that he started to worry about what was going on out there in the northwest part of the country, that maybe something was broken in that place. Blum even writes that according to family conversations that were later passed on to friends, that Michael thought it was maybe the altitude or even demons surrounding the towns of Pullman and Moscow. Again, you have to wonder why he went into such detail about this in the book. I personally think that he was giving a big clue. It's very telling. But we are going to get into that story in a different episode. There's a lot to talk about regarding Brent Kopacka. The chapter ends basically with Brian's father being very worried, just wanting to get him home, and saying that as they drove east through Kansas towards Indiana, that he was constantly on edge. He was watching for the first flakes of snow. And then Blum throws in a detail, a small single-engine Cessna 182 that was following them, shadowing their journey, waiting to strike. Brian, I think it's very telling because we know that they're being followed on their route home. I mean, how are these people knowing what's happening in the car? I thought it was only Brian and his father. So how would Blum know what was going on in Michael's mind, or what Brian was thinking, or even that they were being watched without being given access to that kind of information? I mean, he's writing this as if he was actually in the back seat of that car. And the timing of this book is no accident. In fact, it arrived right when the story was becoming very shaky and you had the public that were becoming very restless. Now you have this deeply researched story that patches every single hole in the timeline that is not being explained by the investigators. And the thing is, Blum doesn't write like an outsider who's looking in on the investigation. He basically writes like he's sitting there in the briefing room, hearing everything firsthand. And he's very clever. He does this by describing the detectives' thoughts, their frustrations. When a journalist gets that close and is fed context straight from the source, it almost becomes impossible to separate reporting from messaging. So it's not about what is said, but about who wanted it to be said. The book to me is not reporting facts. It's giving the investigation a human feel. Remember, when you have an emotional bond, it makes people less likely to question methods like DNA or missing footage. It almost trains the reader to trust what is being said. I think empathy is the easiest way to tell a story. By the time Blum's book hit the shelves, people were not focused on all these inconsistencies. They were focused on the feeling of closure. I mean, he basically told them everything that they thought they needed to know. But you have to remember that this book swayed a lot of people's opinions, because by the time it was never about presenting evidence. It was there to make the reader feel like this case made sense even when it didn't. And I think there is a beauty in doing that, but there's also a big danger in that kind of storytelling. The thing is that Howard Blum doesn't even have to know that he's part of anything. He genuinely believed that he was just doing his job. But you have to understand, behind him there is an entire machinery: public relations advisors, legal teams, media strategists, and they are all benefiting from the story. And the story is aligned with the prosecution's version of events. When I say that Howard Blum was used as a pawn, it's not to insult him. I'm just trying to show how the system works. You have a respected journalist, and he becomes the most effective way to tell a story, because nobody's going to suspect that he's being used. Not even him. Once you have a story like this landing, it doesn't stay confined to the pages of the book. It has a ripple effect. I mean, it's picked up by talk shows. We know, we've seen this happen. And it's recycled into every single headline, even on social media. And that is like an echo chamber effect. In fact, the more the story circulates, the more legitimate it
And you can see this happening a lot with Howard Blum, because whenever he goes on anybody's show and they question him about the book and he tries to tell them his perspective, he gets shot down. He's not allowed to say what he knows. That's what I'm saying. He doesn't even know he's being used. People shut him up. They do not want the story coming out.
So by the time any average viewer tries to fact check any kind of claim in the book, well, they're going to be wrestling with what has been put into their mind. Remember, the storyteller is going to be rewarded, not the victims or their families. And in my opinion, I think they still deserve to have the real answer. You have a situation where people look at this book and they say, you see, even the journalist agrees with what happened. And I mean, this is very scary, because anybody who dares question what has been written starts to look like a conspiracy theorist. There are still a lot of questions that people are asking, because in my opinion, this is the story that has been painted to us. But I'd like to know your thoughts. If you have read the book, don't forget to leave a comment. Even if you haven't, please don't forget to consider subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.